Okay, so I want to talk a bit about Syrian civil war. Now, a Syrian friend of mine recently said he didn't like the term civil war because it implies that the Syrian people are violent. I totally understand his sentiments with that because it must be absolutely, absolutely gut-wrenching to see your country torn apart in that way. But essentially, this is a civil war at this stage with a lot of international factors, of course. Excuse me. I want to talk a bit about history with this because it's really the popular trend nowadays for people to caricature this war as being entirely the fault of the West. And it sort of goes along these lines, and you can pretty much guarantee it with every single online report, at least, about Syria. Doesn't matter what the source is, it's the same sort of responses. Oh, the West funds ISIS. The West is responsible for this. The West reaps what it sows, and so on and so on. So it's this vilification of Western powers in their supposed role of causing the Syrian war. Now, this is a complete abomination of the facts because people seem to have a short memory when it comes to Syria. Now, the first thing that needs to be pointed out is Syria and Iraq are two very different conflicts. How? Because with Iraq, that war started with US UK military intervention or invasion, depending on your viewpoint. I was against it at that time, and I believe that that has been vindicated because Iraq's a complete mess. That goes without saying. And it provoked obviously the largest anti war protest in history. In fact, tomorrow is the anniversary of a massive anti war protest that took place in London in 2003. Um, So that's how the Iraq War began. Now, the Syrian War did not begin with NATO intervention, it began with the Assad regime's response to protests. In March 2011, there were protests in Syria by people who were angry about the detention of a teenage boy in the city of Dara who had allegedly written anti government slogans on a wall saying the people want the fall of the regime. This was a similar slogan that was spread across the Arab world. Um, and the sort of things that Syrians were protesting about were similar to those in Egypt and Qatar and other Arab states: corruption, unemployment, and issues like this. So those who say that this is a simple case of the Assad government versus terrorists don't have a excuse or language but fucking clue what they're talking about. And it makes me very angry that people continue to chirp out that rubbish because it just is not the case. If you ask the average Syrian, and I appreciate not everyone's going to agree on this, but certainly the Syrians I have met are no fans of the Assad regime. That doesn't automatically make them pro ISIS. They hate ISIS just as much. So I hate this lazy thinking that so many people come out with that, oh, Assad's just a good guy trying to protect his country from terrorists. That shows an astonishing ignorance of the nature of the Assad regime. Both Bashar Assad and his father have a long track record of brutally crushing all dissent. Early in this war, when things were starting to get out of hand, it's quite obvious. And in fact, people seem to forget this, but the Assad regime used the Shabiha. Apologies if my pronunciation of that is wrong, but basically they were secret police. And what they done is they went around Damascus and other cities rounding up people suspected of speaking against the government, and they tortured them. These guys were thugs. People seem to forget that. You know, there was images at the time of these guys being bodybuilders and stuff, and yet they had no problem with torturing innocent men, women, and children. So these guys were thugs, and they were directly employed by the Assad regime. Let's never ever lose sight of the fact this was, this is a dictatorship. Um, I know there are Syrians who are pro-Assad, and I think there's two reasons for that. Number one, they really are pro-Assad because they see him as genuinely defending his country from the now terrorist threat, which does exist. And I think the second reason is it's the nature of dictatorship. People are frightened of dictators. So you can't speak against the Assad regime. Therefore, when people say things like all the Syrians back Assad, it's simply misleading. The fact of the matter is, um, you cannot freely express dissent against a dictatorship. So it's utterly misleading to say that the Syrian people, as a people, back Assad. They just don't. There will be those who are pro-Ba'athist, who back the regime, but there's many, many other Syrians who don't, and they're not pro-ISIS. That's this lazy caricature that the government has basically, the Syrian government has repeated over and over and over again to justify its brutal onslaught against the protesters. Now, I'm not questioning the fact that right now they are engaged in a real war against Islamists. And, anyone looking through my channel knows my stance on Islamists. I think they're the scum of the earth. I think they represent a fascist ideology, and that's the tragedy of Syria. There's very, very little moderation left. And that's why, by the way, I feel a lot of Syrian men are leaving the country, because if your choice is fight for the Assad regime, which drops barrel bombs on civilians, or fight for ISIS, which enslaves women, throws homosexuals off buildings, it's etc, etc, what sort of choice is that? This is not a conventional war. It's not pitched armies against pitched armies, and people need to understand that fact. What's happened in Syria over the last 5 years has been a complete tragedy, and it is a failure of the international community. But what I deeply resent is blaming everything on the West. Now, where is the West culpable? The West is culpable for being, in my view, far too close to the Saudi regime. The Saudi regime has, over years, promoted Wahhabism. Now, of course, they will say that they're fighting terrorism and they've experienced terrorism themselves, but it is a fact that Saudi royal family has promoted Wahhabism as an ideology. They've, uh, they've promoted it to madrasas in Pakistan and elsewhere. And this is pretty much the ideology that every Islamist group in the world fuels itself from. Obviously, there's some differences in the circumstances and so on, but generally speaking, ISIS, Boko Haram, Al Shabaab, the Taliban, it all comes down to the same Wahhabist Salafist thinking, which is an extreme interpretation of Islam. Now, what really bothers me, and to be honest, I made this video earlier, but I deleted it because I was so angry at the time that I wasn't really structuring it very well. I was just ranting, and obviously that's not productive. But I do feel very frustrated when people say things like, "Oh, the West is responsible for all of this because the West funds ISIS." No, it's really not that simple. ISIS is funded by at least 21 countries. I'm not going to say the West is entirely innocent. That would be stupid of me. But to say that it's only the West funds ISIS is just misleading. I mean, the nature of the global arms trade is that it is very, very murky. And I suspect that ISIS have got their weapons from the black elements of the global arms trade. It wouldn't be the first time. That's what happened during the Rwandan genocide. So I think that caricaturing this as the West funds ISIS, ask yourself this: would it be to the West's advantage to create a refugee crisis, to create a vicious terrorist organization that wants to bomb our cities? What sort of foreign policy would that be? It would be utterly reckless and counterproductive. So it makes no sense whatsoever. What I'm driving at is, what would the West gain from funding ISIS? It would gain them nothing whatsoever. Um, because this refugee crisis, people say, oh, well, governments always find an excuse to fund organizations and so on, so as to justify an invasion of the Middle East. But consider this: the refugee crisis is provoking a big backlash in Europe, and it's a backlash against European governments. So that makes no sense. Why would they support a terrorist organization creating the humanitarian crisis, or at least partly creating it? I would argue the Assad government is also largely responsible for that. It just makes no sense whatsoever as a foreign policy doctrine. Now, the other thing I want to address, and I know I've made this point before, but it's the role of Russia. There are some incredibly ignorant people out there, and quite a lot of people, who seem to think that Russia is this great savior that's coming in and helping an embattled government protect itself from terrorists. Russia has murdered hundreds of civilians in its air campaigns, because unlike the NATO air campaigns, they have been directly at civilian areas, whereas the NATO campaigns have been directed at oil wells. and the fuel supplies for ISIS strongholds like Raqqa. I don't think there's really strong evidence at all to suggest that Russia is taking on ISIS, although they should, because ISIS poses a threat to everyone. The truth is, Russia, despite what it says, has vested interest in Syria. Now, of course, the US does, of course, Britain does. But what bugs me is people have such double standards on this. They think, oh, well, the role of the UK and the US and France is dubious, but hey, Russia are the good guys. That is astonishingly ignorant. Russia, from day one, has been funding the Assad regime with arms. That's a simple fact. The Assad regime has been bombing civilians absolutely mercilessly, using barrel bombs, using pretty much everything that goes against the Geneva Convention. They've killed literally thousands of civilians. Far more Syrians have died from the Assad regime than they have from ISIS and the other Islamist groups. And I'm not trivializing them. These are sadistic fascist organizations, and I hope they're wiped off the face of the earth. But to simply categorize this as the Assad regime versus terrorists is far too simplistic. Because then, if you get into that sort of thinking, then basically you're justifying the Assad regime's murder of men, women, and children. You know, the innocent men, women, and children killed in Damascus and Aleppo, especially in Aleppo, they're not ISIS fighters, they're Syrian civilians. So it makes me very angry when people portray the regime and Putin's role, for that matter, as being somehow noble. It's not, not at all. I don't even care about people criticizing the West because goodness knows there's many areas you could criticize the West. What I cannot stand is utter hypocrisy of people who come out with these sort of statements. Like, oh, glorious mother Russia is saving Syria. At least Putin has the balls to do something. It's not courageous to fund a regime that murders men, women, and children. That's the actions of a tyrant. And, you know, it would only be consistent with Russia's aggressive militarism over the last 5 years, such as the invasion of Ukraine, which is what it was. So I am sick and tired, quite frankly, of people portraying this conflict as so simple when it's not. It's just not. You can say a lot of things about Syria. What you cannot say is it's a simple situation. And by the way, this quagmire, it's noticeable that it got far worse in 2013. That was after Moscow and Beijing vetoed action. Now, I know what's going to happen with this video. There's going to be people coming on here and saying, oh, you're a right winger, you're a neocon, you're a Zionist, etc., etc., etc. But read my lips here, read my lips. I am not saying that Washington, London, and Paris are not culpable. I am not saying that they are innocent, not for a second. But what I am saying is it is hypocritical to demonize um, NATO countries and completely downplay the role of Russia and Assad. It's perverse, quite frankly, because it just is not the facts. Um, and you know, people just can be. I feel that they're so blinded by their hatred of Western governments that they allow that political agenda to cloud their judgment. So they're not really motivated by humanitarian grounds. They don't really care about Syrian civilians. The truth is, this is the defining conflict of the 2010s. It's by far deadlier than any other conflict. And it is very important that when history is written, it is accurate and people don't just jump into the Assad regime's propaganda. So, once again, I'm not making this video to say that the West is innocent, but I am making it to point out the fact that it is just hypocritical to say that Assad and Moscow are innocent because they clearly are not. And it is right that Russia is being scrutinized right now. So basically, I'm sick and tired of the hypocrisy. If your position is Britain, France, and America are culpable for this, but Russia's the good guy, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Now, if you're Syrian and you're pro Assad, well, you know, that just indicates to me you have a callous contempt for the suffering of your fellow compatriots. And I'm going to leave it there. Actually, I'll say one last thing. I don't claim to know everything about this, but I do feel that I am looking further back than a lot of those who have a knee jerk reaction every time they see something about Syria.